It's always funny, when I first moved to Louisiana, and I'd grown up in Rochester, New York, where it's really cold and you don't have palms at all. And then moving to Louisiana and realizing how many palms there are around and how it was just something that was common for them. So that's something important to notice. But with that, let us get back into our sermon, which I jump-started here. But in essence, this week is important. It's important for us to pay close attention to what happens in our Bible this week. This week is an opportunity for us to take advantage, to reflect, to contemplate the depth of this experience and what Holy Week and Easter and Good Friday and Maundy Thursday and Palm Sunday, what those events mean in our lives and what it is that Christ and God do in our lives. What it means to the church and what it means to the world. Now, Palm Sunday, or if we go with the stories that we heard today from Luke, we might want to call it Cloak Sunday. But regardless of what we call it, it highlights Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, the city that kills prophets, the seat of power in the area, the home of the temple, the holiest of holies. This Sunday frames our kickoff for Holy Week. It helps us to understand the context in which we enter into it. The triumphant entry. Now, the story highlights the triumphant entry of Christ into Jerusalem. But I think it's important for us to know a little bit about the Roman idea of triumph. Now, triumph was a time when a particularly victorious general would enter the city of Rome. And it was a large procession and a religious festival in the city of Rome. Now, of course, the true triumph only happened in Rome and would have never happened in Jerusalem. But there would have been many other similar ceremonies that were based off this idea of triumph, or the triumphal entry, the triumphal victorious entry. And certainly people living in Jerusalem at this time would have had some familiarity with it. A triumph could only be ordered by the Roman Senate. In fact, in the history of the Roman Empire, it was such a special occurrence that it only happened about 500 times in the entire length of that history. Now, it was quite an affair. I did a little research this week, and it included a lot of people. First off, the Senate would enter into the city if parading. Directly behind the Roman Senate, there would be a large group of trumpeters. Following that would be carts filled with the spoils of war. And this certainly would have been a pretty long line of things in itself. Now, behind that, there were 2 white bulls that would be sacrificed at the temple of Jupiter. Then there would be the weapons and the insignia of the captured army. If there were captured enemy leaders or their relatives, they would go behind them, followed by the general's personal bodyguards. Then the general, who was pulled on a chariot by 2 horses, followed then by the adult sons and officers of the general, and then finally the entirety of the army that was involved in the battle. Now, this would have all been highly choreographed and would have taken some time to move through the streets of Rome. In general, the general at the center of the whole ordeal would have had a very specific tunic that would have only been worn in these occasions. Said that he had painted his face red, and he would have had a servant following close by, holding a golden wreath over his head. Now, like I said, people in Jerusalem probably didn't make it to Rome too often, so they had never seen a full triumph or such an entry. But Jerusalem certainly had their own entries. It's noted in our Easter story that Herod was in the city, and his entrance certainly would have involved a pretty big entrance, quite a bit of pomp and circumstance. There were designated entries for kings. It would have been an impressive display, to say the least. Now let's place this idea of the pomp and circumstance of a Roman triumphant entry to the entry of Jesus. Right off the bat, we realize that Christ is on the colt of a donkey, not on an immense chariot, but on a donkey that has cloaks, not a saddle, no rich cloths or linens. Also important to note, Jesus does not have permission to process into the city in such a manner, and in essence, he's kind of breaking the rules by coming in this way. Jesus is also processing through a back gate, not the main gate of the city like Herod would have. The folks that were there watching do not have high-priced ornaments like the Romans would have had. Rather, they simply placed their coats upon the road, one of their most important possessions. The celebration that exists here is very real and heartfelt, not an obligation of the state. We also know from this story that Jesus upset some of the Pharisees and the scribes as they tried to quiet the crowd. We don't know exactly why the Pharisees get upset. It could be that they're worried about Roman authorities, what they might say about the event. They're worried that the Romans could see it as a mockery, a breach of the law regarding entry into the city. Or the Pharisees might have been upset just that Jesus seemed perceived as the Messiah. We don't know, but they do get worked up. Also important to note about this entry is that the folks that were celebrating, they worked in the fields outside the city. And they were fully aware of who Christ was. The word of who he was had been spreading, and it was moving particularly fast among the lowest rungs of Roman society. Jesus' entry clearly stands in contrast to the traditions of Rome, but was close enough to have an intentional meaning to those around him. That he was turning the Roman societal structure on its head. That the least of those would know of his coming and celebrate, and that they came for him, that he came for them in humility. This is truly a very different kind of triumph. But this is not the only contrast that exists in the midst of Palm Sunday. Compare the joyous entry of Christ on Palm Sunday with the persecution of Christ on Good Friday. In this moment, on this Sunday, the people are joyous at Christ's coming. They have heard about him. They know why he has come. He is there for them. Yet only a few days later, in front of Pilate, the people are shouting for his crucifixion. They are jeering at him as he carries the cross, mocking him as he hangs to die. In Holy Week, between Palm Sunday and Good Friday, we see both sides of Jerusalem. We see the city that is cheering for its Messiah, and we see the city that kills its prophets. In one place, we see both sides. We see the contradictions that exist in one place, so stark that they can be shocking. So in the importance of this week, we ask ourselves, how do we confront these contradictions? How do we approach such different accounts of a single city? We crave for neat and clean answers that are not messy. We don't want to have to delve into the work of weighing pros and cons, of engaging in ethical assessments. And yet, when we do actually get neat answers to our questions, when we do actually come in contact with completely consistent people? Or yet, do we ever get neat answers? Do we ever come into contact with consistent people or situations? One where there is an easy way to figure out who is right and who is wrong. But the church certainly is not that place. The church falls into this trap on a regular basis. When I chat with folks that don't go to church, I'll ask them, well, why don't you go to church? And I do get a myriad of reasons for why people don't go to church. But one of the ones that I've heard more than once is that churches are full of hypocrites. Now, there are many that have convinced themselves that the church should be a place where everyone is nice to each other, where nobody, particularly the pastor, ever makes a mistake. But those of us who have spent our lives in the church, we have seen churches and pastors, for that matter, make missteps. We have seen our own hypocrisies. We have seen the church as a group of people celebrating the entrance of Christ into Jerusalem. And we have also seen the church as the crowd demanding the crucifixion of Christ. So what do we do with this? What does this mean to us? In some sense, I believe that it means we have to be willing to acknowledge our own contradictions and be willing to hold them in tension to some degree. We have to be willing to admit our own imperfections as a reminder that we need to turn to God and follow the love that God gives us. It means we have to be honest enough to admit that good people will sometimes sin and bad people are capable of turning it all around. It means that we may never fully understand all the nuances of biblical teaching, and it should warn us from being too confident in our readings of those teachings. Most importantly, I believe, we can remember that even in our imperfections, Christ is willing to come meet us where we are. In our imperfect church, Christ is still here. Christ is willing to come to us in pain. Christ is willing to come to us in suffering, in our anger, in our jealousy, but also in our love and our compassion. On the day of celebration, on Palm Sunday, we see a Christ that weeps over Jerusalem. And on Good Friday, we see a Christ that forgives those that put him on the cross. Christ comes to meet us, to share with us the love of God, a love that exceeds all possible knowledge, and calls us through our own humanness, and our own sinfulness, and our own contradictions, and our own imperfections. So as we enter this Holy Week, fully ready to experience the depth of emotions that this week offers, the highest highs and the lowest lows, let us remind ourselves of these contradictions. To forgive ourselves, to forgive others, and to embrace the love of God and go into the world and simply meet people where they are, sharing the love that knows no bounds. Amen. With that, let us join our voices together with songs and stand the hymn, Take My Life, which is hymn number 391. We'll be singing verses 1, 2, and 6.